Hebrew lesson comes from Kings 19, 1 through 14. Elijah flees to Horeb. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and now he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judea, he left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once the angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then he lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and he ate and drank. Strengthened by the food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. The Lord appears to Elijah, and the word of the Lord came to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, tore down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, tore down your altars, and put the prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." So ends the reading.
Charles C. Clark is a name you've probably not heard about, but he has saved thousands and thousands of lives. He had some great ideas, and he tried to get NASA to follow his ideas. It had to do with airbags. But NASA decided to go another way until they came to the launch to Mars, sending the rover to Mars. And they had a problem because to get out of the Earth's orbit, you have to go 25,000 miles an hour. And then you will travel at that speed all the way to Mars. And when you hit, you've got to slow down. So when you hit the atmosphere, the heat shield takes a lot of the energy, turns it into plasma. But the atmosphere on Mars is not as thick as our atmosphere, so it doesn't do enough. So then you have to deploy the chutes. But once again, the air is thinner there, and the chutes doesn't slow you near enough, and that's where Clark's invention came in. You have to go with airbags. Now, the landing is a little rough. I wouldn't want to be in that. But it's fine for a robotic rover, and it does dissipate the energy when you come to a sudden screeching halt. Clark wanted to put these things on the bumpers of cars to keep the car from being hurt. Detroit didn't care. They just didn't care. In 1965, I believe it was, there were 46,000 automobile deaths. But they didn't care. If we admitted they're our fault, then we'd be sued by everybody for having those deaths, right? Ralph Nader wrote a book that year called Unsafe at Any Speed, and a lot of his statistics came from Clark. And finally we figured out, finally the cost of a car got high enough that we could include an airbag in the price. And here's what it looks like. And plus, a future possibility for motorcycles. Let's see this is what happens. Wow, huh? I'll bet he's saying, dang. Coming to a screeching halt. It's tough. And it's tough not just physically, it is tough mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, because we're going along, doing our business, everything's going just fine, and then all of a sudden, bam, you are struck by some ailment, or somebody in your family, something has happened, or there is something just comes out of the blue, or you get stroked, or you have a major ailment. And suddenly, life comes to a screeching halt. We all know how this is. You've probably had moments in your lives where everything stopped. I know everybody deals with something about January, because we just had Christmas, and we've been busy, we've been partying, and we've been cooking, and we've been families and decorating and trees and lights and all that stuff, and buying gifts and all that, and then the morning is over, and then comes January. And you have that screeching halt in your life. Now, part of it is because we tend to be busy. As a culture, we think busy is good. We try to get ourselves overloaded, if we can, with jobs and kids and games and lessons and parties and clubs and maybe church. Sometimes it feels like church is the last meatball on the end of the smorgasbord of life, and even when you take it, it has a tendency to fall off the plate. Because there's just so much until it comes to a stop. And what do you do then? What do you do? Try to get busy again? Or does everything change in your life? The problem with coming to a screeching halt is that momentum. Things have been going along. Things have been hard and exciting and challenging. And all of a sudden, it's over. And that's what Elijah went through. You remember Elijah? A couple weeks ago, we talked about what he did to the priests of Baal. He challenged them to a big contest of who could draw the fire of their God down to their altar. And the gods of the priests of Baal, they did everything. They danced around, they hopped around, and they sang songs, and they, all kinds of stuff, even chopped themselves and cut themselves and sprinkled blood on their altar. But nothing happened. Elijah soaked his altar in water. And they called upon God, and God set the altar on fire. And then the people were so amazed, Elijah incited them into a riot, and the people raised up and they killed all 450 priests of Baal. Massacred them right there. And Elijah had won. You know how much work he put in on this? He had been struggling against the priests of Baal for years, and now he had reached the pinnacle, and he won. Until Jezebel heard about it. Jezebel, the queen from Tyre, who had brought the Baal worship to Israel. And she says, I would have worse done to me. Make the gods do worse to me if Elijah isn't dead in 24 hours. So Elijah ran. He ran and he ran and he ran until he was down south of Jerusalem at a place called Beersheba, and he collapsed. And he couldn't go on. And he said, Lord, take my life. Screeching halt. But God didn't do that. God sent an angel who put bread and drink in front of him there in the desert. And did it again the next night while Elijah slept. And then he told him, go down to Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. You'll see me there. So he trudged down to Mount Sinai. And he found a cave near the top of the mountain. And he cries out, Lord, I can't go on. Your people, the Israelites, have forsaken you. They've torn down your altars. They've killed every prophet. I'm the only one left, and they want to kill me. Ever felt like that? I can't go on. No place to go. Elijah had reached the bottom. But there's still a lot of momentum. You know, with a spiritual screeching halt, you can hit the emotional bottom, but there's still this momentum that's left over from everything before, and it needs to be dissipated somehow. And here's what Elijah saw.
God asked me to step out of the cave, for God was about to pass by. I did as God asked. Now this is the part I can't believe you missed. I had been standing there for a moment when a fierce wind began to blow. I was sure God was in the wind, and I expected to hear God. But the wind got quiet. God was not in the wind. After the wind stopped, it was quiet and still. Then I started noticing things around me shaking. Suddenly the ground began to shake, and I realized I was in the middle of a great earthquake. I was sure God was in the earthquake, but it stopped. God was not in the earthquake. Then I saw a roaring fire in front of me. I was sure God would be in the fire, but no, God was not in the fire either. Once more, everything was still.
And a still small voice asked, what are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for your covenant. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. He says exactly the same thing. Before, when he still has way too much momentum, and at the end where he has come to accept the facts of his life. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. The power of God is greater than the greatest power in this world. Wind, earthquake, fire, all of these huge things that happen, and we expect God to be in the midst of that, casting down the lightning bolts on the wicked. But God is not in those things. Those are just dissipating the momentum of a spiritual stop for Elijah. They're just the airbags, if you will. There's huge power in this world, but God comes then when those have passed in a still, small voice. What do you do when you come to a screeching halt? You name it. You name what the problem is, what you are missing, how you feel that you've reached the end. And then you pray to God. And there'll be some wild things happening, but God isn't in those wild things. God is in the still small voice who asks you once again, what are you doing here? And even if your answer is exactly the same, you have learned the difference. Elijah heard from God that he was called to go to Damascus, where there were a lot of people who still believed in Yahweh, in God. And there was work to be done. He put him back on his feet, and he gave him a job, and he pointed him forward. And that's what God does when we reach that screeching halt. Maybe that's why we have to reach a screeching halt, so that God can take us, hold us, love us, stand us up, and point us in the right direction. That's the power. That's the power that will hold us, and the power that heals us. Thanks be to God.